So I've been collecting and working with my dreams since 1978. That's 40 years now. And mostly the dreams are like stories, which I then have to try to unscramble and interpret in the mornings. But occasionally I get a dream in which a disembodied voice just dictates some lesson or some teaching to me. And then I have to get up and just write it down before I forget it. So last Wednesday morning, about 4 o'clock in the morning, 28th of February, I had such a voice which dictated what I want to read right now. And it came out as a series of just 11 one-liners. So here's what I wrote when I woke up. Number 1, quantum entanglement is simply God hugging her children. Number 2, sentient beings are islands of awareness in the ocean of love, which we call God. Number 3, sleeping sentient beings, however, see the other islands as competitors and the ocean as separation. Number 4, compassion is the ability to temporarily disidentify with one's own ego and experience the pain of another's ego. And then the next 7 came as a response to kind of one-line descriptions of what we learned in catechism as the 7 deadly sins: pride, covetousness, lust, anger, gluttony, envy, and sloth. So they're one-liner descriptions of all 7. Number 1, pride. Pride is the black hole of the psyche which sucks love and light out of the environment of relationships. Number 2, covetousness is wanting another's wages without having to do their work. Number 3, lust is reducing another's soul to merely their spacesuit. Number 4, anger is the ego's fear of annihilation based on amnesia for one's eternal essence. Number 5, gluttony is an attempt to contend with a famine phobia by refusing to ever experience hunger. Number 6, envy is an attempt at the hostile takeover of another's talents or success. And finally, sloth is the perennial postponement of the mission of incarnation. Words inspired by God. So for the last 5 or 6 months, I've been working furiously on a new book. And I'm putting about 6 or 7 hours a day into it. I'm loving this exercise. And for the last month in particular, I've been reading very, very deeply through the book of Genesis. What I'm trying to do is, I'm trying to extract the portrait of God that emerges, or to be more specific, the caricature of God that emerges from the scriptures. And to look at the heroes and the heroines that come through in the book of Exodus, in the book of Genesis. There are 50 chapters in the book of Genesis. And having gone through all the characters of Genesis, beginning with Adam and Eve, and then Noah and his sons, and then Abraham and Sarah, and then Isaac and Rebekah, and then Jacob and Rachel, right down to Joseph, all these characters, there's not a single one of them whom I would vote for city council. Not a single one of them. So I'm trying to extract, what is the meaning, what are the lessons in going through this. And what I see that in the entire book of Genesis, 50 chapters, basically there's one theme which repeats over and over and over again. It's the notion of sin, punishment, and human suffering. That's basically what runs through the entire text of the book of Genesis. Now, I decided then I needed to address that issue today in the homily. So I'm going to make 3 main points this morning. I want to talk about, firstly, the evolution of the notion of sin throughout history, not just in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, but throughout history. And then secondly, I want to talk about the evolution of the notion of guilt. And then thirdly, I want to examine, the causes of human suffering. So there are the 3 points I'll make this morning. So to begin with the first one, the evolution of the notion of sin. Way back when Homo Sapiens Sapiens evolved, which is about 70,000 years ago. Before that, 200,000 years ago, we had Homo sapiens, which were thinking beings, but they could not think about thinking. They didn't have language skills. Language is the ability to manipulate symbols intracranially and to come up with language. So we only developed that about 70,000 years ago. And when we did, we began to experiment with altered states of consciousness. And the great shamanistic spiritual system was really, really good at this, using a whole bunch of techniques to alter one state of consciousness. So they experimented with stuff like chanting, drumming, dancing, singing, the infliction of pain, and also with entheogens, plants that created altered states of consciousness. So one of the things they discovered that among these altered states of consciousness, possibly the single most attractive one was having mystical experiences where you came in contact with and dialogued with the gods of various kinds. But this is a very, very dangerous exercise. The Bible itself says it's a very dangerous thing to fall into the hands of God. And so the elders at some stage began to realize that people who happen upon these experiences and are unprepared for it, one or two things is going to happen. You're going to go crazy, because once you experience the mystical state, it is very difficult to come back and operate in the normal world. So you're permanently mad if you don't know how to handle these kinds of experiences. Or the other danger is that you get inflated. And inflation is a particularly virulent kind of narcissism. We think, oh, what a great guy am I. Look what I've just experienced. And so the elders decided that there had to be some kind of initiation ceremonies or preparation before people stumbled upon these experiences. So they set a whole bunch of restrictions so that the uninitiated couldn't happen upon these kinds of experiences. Then these restrictions were called the taboo. So breaking the taboo, deciding, consciously or wandering into such an experience was breaking the taboo. And I'm convinced that that's actually the first notion of sin that we come across in human history. The notion that there is a taboo protecting us against unsolicited or accidental encounters with the divine, which are either going to make us mad, or inflated, and then people intentionally break that taboo. That's the first notion of sin. So that goes way, way back to our early origins. Throughout history, then, the notion of sin begins to change. And the second notion of sin, I believe, was that gods made covenants with particular tribes of people. There were many, many gods, there were many tribes of people, and particular gods made covenants with particular groups of people. And basically it was that this god would protect them in some fashion if they worshipped only that god. It's called monolatry. There was no sense of monotheism at that stage. Monotheism is the belief that there is only a single God. Monolatry is the worship of a particular God while you acknowledge that there are many, many other gods as well. But your covenant is with this particular guy. So the second level of sin then was you make a covenant with a particular God, and somehow you're in breach of the contract in some way. And then this God is going to punish you. So that's the second notion of sin, as far as I can see. That it's the breach of a contract. And what applies here is a notion called corporate singularity. The tribe was regarded as a singularity, as a specific unit. And so it didn't matter which member of the tribe committed the breach, everybody was guilty. It would be the equivalent of saying, it's Lawrence who broke the law, why are you punishing me? That wouldn't make any sense. It would be like somebody, with a gun assassinating somebody else and then claiming that the only part of him that was guilty was his right index finger because it pulled the trigger, but that the rest of him was guiltless. Wouldn't make any sense to them. Anybody in the tribe breaks the covenant, everybody in the tribe is guilty. Now this isn't so far-fetched. We still continue to do that in our time. We ourselves, as an American empire, we've done this in Iraq, we've done it in Afghanistan, we've done it in Libya, and we've tried to do it in Syria. Where to take out a dictator, you go in and you slaughter hundreds of thousands of people. So this notion of everybody being guilty for the sin of a particular individual is still alive and kicking in our times. So that was the second kind of evolution of the notion of sin, it seems to me. Then came the notion of law, and that came quite late. The first codification of law appears in Mesopotamia about the year 2100 BCE, and it's called the Code of Ur-Nammu. It's followed about 400 years later by a well-known one called the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi had 282 precepts in his system. So there's some kind of a codification of rules that are governing human, public, and private behavior. You find them in the Mosaic Code about 1250 BC. You find it among the Celtic peoples. It was called the Brehon Laws among the Celts. So at some stage, we started creating bunches of legislation and claiming that they came from the gods. And so now sin takes on a third meaning, and it is to be in breach of a particular law, to break a particular commandment. And so in our own times, there are so many laws in America right now that the average American citizen is committing a felony on a daily basis. There are so many on the statute books, we have no idea how many laws we're breaking. So this was the next event, was that there are laws, and if you're in breach of a particular commandment or piece of legislation, then you're a sinner. Fast forward to the time of the New Testament, and you have St. Paul. And Paul is giving 3 different kinds of sources for sin, or explanations of sin. The first one he agrees is, yes, he said, before there were laws, there was no sin. If sin is the infraction of a precept, and there are no precepts to begin with, no matter what you do, it can't be sinful. No matter what the consequences are, it's not a sin, because there's no law that you have broken. So Paul says that's the first reason. Before there was law, there was no sin was possible. But he says there's a second source of sin, and that's, he calls it the flesh. He says, the good that I would, I do not. It is the evil I do not want to do, I find myself doing. So there's some kind of an antagonism within the psyche itself that's leading us to do bad stuff. And Paul gives a third explanation. He says, but mainly he says, evil and sin comes from outside. He says we're contending with cosmic entities. He's talking about some kinds of extraterrestrial beings who interfere constantly in human affairs and cause us to do bad stuff. So there's another definition of sin, according to Paul. And then comes Augustine, about 400 years after Paul, and Augustine comes up with this crazy notion that he called original sin. Augustine is living at a stage when the Roman Empire is under siege from the barbarians from Germany, the Celts coming down from the north. And so Rome is based on rationality and everything being legislated for. And now come these barbarians who are totally irrational, and they're destroying the empire. And Augustine was of the opinion that human beings most resemble God when they're rational, and they're most unlike God when they're irrational and out of control. And then he came to the conclusion that at the moment of orgasm, a couple that are having orgasm are most irrational and therefore most ungodlike. And what happens at that stage? They conceive a baby. And so the baby is conceived with original sin. And there are 3 consequences for this. Because they're conceived when the couple are out of control completely, most ungodlikely, then the will is weakened, the intellect is darkened, and the body is subject to sickness and aging and death. So there was Augustine's synopsis of it. Now, when you go through that entire trajectory, my belief system is actually that there is only one sin. The other stuff I've just mentioned are just epiphenomena. They're the kind of collateral damage. The only sin is staying asleep. It is refusing to wake up to the reality of who you are. It's the inability to penetrate the illusion of Maya and to think that we're separate entities. So the only sin is to refuse to wake up to the realization that there is only God. I keep saying to you, in some senses, everything that exists is simply God in drag. The life is a dream that the ego is having, and the ego is a dream that the soul is having, and the soul is a dream that spirit is having, and spirit is a dream that God is having. So they're just nested dreams. I'm not saying that they're not real. Every level of the dream is real, but there are more pristine levels of it. And so when we come to the realization that literally we are the characters in God's dream, and that every one of us in fact is God stuff, then a lot of the dangers go away. That's what awakening is like. At that stage, then, if you refuse to do that, the other stuff is going to happen. But the other stuff is basically just collateral damage. So it fascinated me as I began reading the book of Genesis just this month, go really deeply into it, that already in chapter 3, the first fall, where Eve looks, having spoken with the talking snake, and there are 2 trees in the garden that they're not allowed to eat of, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And Eve looks at the fruit of the tree and she sees 3 things. Firstly, it looks good. Secondly, she can imagine it tastes good, but much more importantly, it will confer wisdom upon her. So rather than this being the first sin, for me, this was the first indication that the human species was actually waking up. It was going from just being Homo sapiens to going to be Homo sapiens sapiens. So Eve was on the forefront of the motion of awakening. She was fascinated by the idea of acquiring wisdom. Now, there's a big difference between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge are simply data points that we've inferred from the physical environment and that we work on with our little laptop up here. between the brain. Wisdom is very different. Wisdom is information that comes from the metaphysical and is operated on by the soul or by the heart. And so this is what she was attempting to do. She wasn't just interested in biting into a piece of fruit. She was interested actually in waking up. So I wonder what she was actually biting into. We think that she ate an apple. There's no mention of an apple in the book of Genesis. We were told she ate the fruit of the tree. So was it some kind of entheogen that woke her up? Whatever the experience was, she had a totally different mindset afterwards. So for me, the only sin is the refusal to wake up, to refuse to see beyond the illusion of Maya, and to take the world on its own terms, to think that we're actually separate entities from each other. So that's the first point I'll make. That's the kind of a quick look at the evolution of the notion of sin. The second point I want to make then, I want to look at the evolution of the notion of guilt. And at one stage, many years ago, I worked myself through the entire scriptures, from the book of Genesis to the book of Revelation. And I was trying to figure out, is there some kind of evolutionary trajectory to the notion of culpability, or guilt? And I identified, I think, what are 7 basic stages in the process. And I'm going to go through the 7 fairly quickly, but I'm going to spend time on number 6. So the first stage of guilt was what I call passing the apple. So God comes down in Genesis chapter 3. He's told them not to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. They've done it anyway. And now they realize they're naked and they hide. And God comes down looking for them. So God accosts Adam and says, "Why did you do that? I told you not to do it." And Adam says, "It wasn't me. Jane. Me, Adam, you, Jane. You're responsible." So he passes on to Jane. Jane doesn't want to take responsibility. She says, "It was the snake. The snake tempted me and I fell." And God says to the snake, "Why did you do that?" And the snake said, "You created me." So we're going full circle. Nobody will take responsibility for anything that's happening. That's stage 1 in the process of guilt. Stage 2 is, in fact, even whether they're guilty or not, God is going to punish everybody. So the second stage of guilt is, everybody is going to be punished for this. I don't know who did it, but I'm going to punish everybody. So they're kicked out of the garden in perpetuity. And God gives them their bags and says, "Get out. And if you have kids, they're not welcome back here. And if you have grandkids, I don't want to see them. You're out forever." So everybody in perpetuity is going to be punished for the sin of Adam and Eve. So that's the second stage of it. The third stage is God kind of cools down after a few thousand years and sees that he's going way down in the poles. He needs to do something. So he creates this notion of the scapegoat. That even though a whole bunch of people are guilty, let's just pick out one person and we punish him, and I'll be satisfied. My anger will be satisfied. So they came up with a custom where once a year, all of the people would come to Aaron, who was Moses' brother, and they'd all confess their sins to Aaron. And then Aaron would hold this list of sins, and he'd get a goat from the flock, and he'd confess all the sins of the people onto the goat. And the goat was sent off into the desert to be eaten by lions or whatever. And that's the origin of the notion of the scapegoat. The goat took the sins of everybody else. So again and again and again, you'll find situations where, even though a whole bunch of people are guilty, you're going to punish one person. And this is the origin of this crazy notion in Christian theology that somehow God, who was really, really angry at human beings for sinning, and therefore Satan had now captured us, God threw us out of the garden, Satan welcomed us into his place, and now God wants us back. But the price to get us back is to sacrifice his only son. Lawrence mentioned this morning about Genesis chapter 22, where Abraham was prepared to sacrifice Isaac, but finally didn't have to do it. It seems God went all the way, and God, according to Christian theology, did sacrifice his only son in order to get the rest of us back. So this notion somehow of the scapegoat comes right through into Christian theology as well. That was stage 3. Stage 4 is God backs off a little bit further and he comes up with a plan B. And this is, if somebody sins, I'll punish him and his kids and the grandkids and the great-grandkids, but after that, I let go. So I'm only going to punish people to the 3rd or 4th generation. What an extraordinary, loving, compassionate God this guy is. Yeah? I'm going to back off after 4 generations. You're going to get a get out of jail free card. And that worked for a piece of time. The stage number 5 then, it comes about 600 years before Jesus, about the time of Jeremiah, the great prophet Jeremiah, and the prophet Ezekiel. And they quote a Hebrew proverb that says, "The parents have eaten sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge." So you know the experience where you eat something sour and your teeth feel really, really weird? So the proverb was, the parents ate the sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge. In other words, the parents ate the grapes, but the children are suffering the results of it. And Ezekiel and Jeremiah said, no longer will this proverb hold in Israel. From now on, only the culprit will be guilty of their own sin. And that seemed like, wow, we've gone all the way at this stage. That's the end of the line. You can't go further than that. That everybody is responsible for the stuff they do themselves and nobody else is held accountable. But there are actually 2 more stages after that. And the first stage after that, stage 6, I want to kind of expand on a little bit. At one stage, Christ says, speaking to the teachers of his time, to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, says, woe to you scribes and Pharisees. You bind heavy loads and you put them on people's shoulders and you won't lift a single finger yourself to help out. So what's Christ saying? In effect, he's saying, sometimes authority figures must take at least some responsibility for the sins of people if they're creating extraordinary laws, unjust laws. Now, as I was reading through the book of Genesis, the only character that seemed to me that had real integrity, and I was really happy, so finally I get to the end of the book of Genesis, I found somebody, whom I could elect to the city council. And it's Joseph. Remember the story of Joseph, the son of Jacob, for whom he made the long, multicolored coat, and his brothers sell him into slavery in Egypt. But he rises through the ranks. He becomes the second most important person in Egypt under the Pharaoh himself. And he has a dream, the Pharaoh has a dream, which Joseph interprets of, that translated as 7 years of great harvest followed by 7 years of famine. Remember that story? And so Pharaoh sets Joseph in charge of his entire household. And he says, I want you to buy up all the excess grain in the country during the 7 years of great harvest so that we'll have stocks for the 7 years of famine. And Joseph goes out and he uses the Pharaoh's money and he buys all the excess grain for the first 7 years. And then the famine hits and people go through their resources and they don't have any more food. This is right at the end of the book of Genesis. So what does Joseph do? The people come to Joseph and they say, we have no food. And Joseph says, fine, we got plenty of food here, but you have to pay for it. So give me your money and I'll give you the grain. So they hand over all their money to Joseph. So now they have no money, but at least they can eat for the year. But the famine continues for a second year. And now they don't have any money to buy the grain. So they go to Joseph and say, we're hungry. It's getting worse and worse, but we have no money to buy the grain. Joseph says, well, you have livestock, you have cattle. You give me your cattle and I'll give you grain for a year or two. So they hand over all their livestock to Joseph, and he takes it all on behalf of the Pharaoh, and he gives them food for a year or two. Year 3 comes, and the famine still continues. They come back to Joseph and they says, we don't have any money, we don't have any livestock, we have our fields, our land, if you take the land from us and give us grain, we'll be dead happy. So now they can't even grow vegetables for themselves. They give all the land, and all the land belongs to Pharaoh. But the famine continues for a 4th year. They come back, we don't have money to buy it, we don't have livestock we can give to you, we don't have land, all we have left is ourselves. We'll become Pharaoh's slaves if only you'll give us food. And so now Pharaoh owns all of them. And then year 5, there's a further restriction. He says, henceforth, if you ever manage somehow to make any kind of money, we're going to charge you 20% taxes every year. That was the final blow, and they agreed to it. Now, the upsetting thing to me is, at the end of that story, the people come to Joseph and they say, you are our savior. You've saved us from famine. You've taken our money, you've taken our livestock, you've taken our land, you've taken ourselves, and we're now paying 20% taxes on anything we do have, but you're our savior. And I look at it and say, how could anybody, regard such a person as a savior? Until I wake up and I find myself in the world in which we live today. And we're going through exactly the same kind of thing. So you've got all over the world, you've got little oligarchies, the 1%, who own, more than half of the world's wealth is owned by 66 people right now. So you've got this little oligarchy who have all the resources. And what do? They create artificial crisis, stage 1. Secondly, the mass media, the prostitutes, as some people call them, holler and scream about, the problems we're in, we need a solution, and here's what we need. And the people cry out, yes, that's the solution we need. We need the government to come in and take control and to save us. And then the oligarchy comes in and says, well, we can do it, but in order to do that, you're going to have to surrender civil rights and human rights, and we're going to have to kind of change the constitution a little bit, but then we'll protect you. So if you want security, you have to give up your civil rights. And we say, yes, bless, save us. You're our savior. Now the thing is, the oligarchy they created the crisis, often by false flags, and they already knew what the solutions were, and they gave the solutions to the press to shout for, and the people think that they came up with the solutions themselves. And you see that happening all over the world again and again and again and again. So that's what Jesus Christ was railing against back in his own time. That very, very often, the last stage of culpability or the last stage of guilt is not that each individual is responsible for their own crime, but that bad systems, bad political or economic models that are forcing people to become criminals, that they have to take some responsibility for what's happening here. That was stage 6 in what I figured out. But there's a stage 7, and that's interesting. Now, what do you do when you find yourself, in the power of such an oligarchy or such an economic model or such a political system? There are 2 responses. You can become, a violent revolutionary, or you can become an enlightened evolutionary. Now, what I've seen in my time in Africa, in the 1960s and 70s, many of the countries in Africa were getting their independence from colonialist regimes that had oppressed them for 200 or 300 years. But what happened very, very quickly is that civil war developed in the newly emergent free countries. And so there'd be a dictator in place which was really oppressing the people, and a guerrilla movement would come in to remove him, and all you did is you swapped one vicious oligarch for another. Because when you overthrow violence violently, you become violent yourself. So you can become either a violent revolutionary, or you can become an enlightened evolutionary. Now, people like the Dalai Lama or Mahatma Gandhi or Jesus Christ have shown that ultimately, if you want long-term permanent solutions to the human condition, violence is not going to cut the mustard. And so the stage 7 of the guilt was Jesus Christ dedicated his entire life, having identified what the problems were and who the problem makers were, responding in compassion to everybody. Living in a loving fashion in order to address the situation rather than living in an angry fashion and trying to violently overthrow and become violent in the process. That's my second point. So my last point then is this. I looked then at, is there some way we can kind of just isolate what are the factors that create human suffering? And there are several different kinds of factors. The first one we might call acts of God. And acts of God for me has 3 different sub-categories. So typically when we think of acts of God, we think kind of natural disasters. Floods, hurricanes, volcanoes, meteorite strikes or whatever. So we can do nothing about that. They just happen. But we call them acts of God. The second kind of acts of God that create human suffering are beliefs in gods, or a God who's a micromanager and who intervenes constantly in human affairs. I always remember one of the very famous televangelists, I can't quite remember his name at this stage, after 9/11, coming out and saying, this is God punishing America because of homosexuality. It's because we haven't wiped out homosexuals in our midst. God is punishing us by 9/11. This kind of mindset. So that God still intervenes with these horrendous responses to human sin. That would be an act of God in some sense. The older systems actually believed, when you read through the Greco-Roman world or the Sumerian world, that very, very often human suffering was occasioned by as collateral damage when the gods themselves were making war with each other. And in fact, the whole story of Exodus, the second book of Torah, is the same story. It's the God of the Hebrews contending with the gods of the Egyptians, and in the crossfire, millions of people getting killed. So this notion, an act of God could be collateral damage as the gods duke it out among themselves. So that'd be the first category. The second category of human suffering appears to me, it's the whole notion of the ego. I think it may have been Ramakrishna who said at one stage that all human suffering lies in the gap between the ego and the soul. This disidentification process. When I identify with an ego, then I'm separate from God, I'm separate from you, and I'm separate from nature. And there's a whole bunch of human suffering comes in because of those kinds of distinctions. And that's what this line about, sentient beings was saying to me on Wednesday morning last. When we separate ourselves out and we see others as islands separated from us by the ocean, we have all kinds of problems. So much human suffering is occasioned by an ego which separates us from God, from each other, and from nature. The third way is that I really believe that planet Earth herself is actually a living, dynamic organism, a Gaia. It is an extraordinarily intelligent being that orchestrates its life forms, and like any great being, it's attempting to achieve and to maintain homeostasis. You push any organism out of homeostasis, and it attempts to get back into alignment with itself. You keep pushing planet Earth out of homeostasis by the ecological depredation that we're visiting upon her through human activity, and she's going to respond. And so a lot of human suffering is not that this Mother Earth is a vindictive creature who's paying us back, but she's attempting to maintain her own health. And in doing that, she's going to have to create conditions, to kind of quell human activity. That would be a third source, it seems to me, of human suffering. A fourth source, it seems to me, would be the very nature of the human space suit. It is not designed to be immortal. It ages, it gets sick, and it dies. And so a lot of what we experience as human suffering is just, we volunteered for incarnation. We volunteered to inhabit these spacesuits that have a shelf life. And as part of that experience, part of the volunteering is to experience, mortality. So that's a fourth source. And the fifth source, I think, is, human conflict, where either interpersonally or internationally, we visit all kinds of warfare and violence upon each other. So you put all these together and you have human suffering. Now, what do we do about it? There are two responses, it seems to me. The first response is to distinguish between pain and suffering. The Buddha said it very famously one time. He said, pain is inevitable. Pain is the price of incarnation. You sign up for incarnation, and you sign up for a planet in which there's earthquakes and a body that gets aged, and you signed up because you wanted to have that experience for some reason. So that's pain, that's inevitable. Suffering is optional. Suffering is a result of the stories we make up about the pain we're experiencing. So if you make up bad cosmologies to try to explain away the reasons for the pain you're experiencing, then you're going to have suffering. Now, so suffering is totally optional. That's the first thing, distinguish between the two. And then the final piece is, having made that distinction, is to start disidentifying with the ego. This interior mechanism, this part of the psyche which separates us out from each other. Now, the ego has a function. We need a sense of separate self in order to navigate in the physical world. But as long as it's a sense of separate self and not an identification with separate self, we're fine. We need it temporarily to navigate the physical realms, but we can't identify with it. So the disidentification with the ego and the re-identification with the soul, when we get it, that we are spirits in spacesuits, the suffering ceases and we can work with the pain.